My mother told everyone I was adopted. For 8 years, she showed relatives the papers, the notarized letter, the whole performance. She used it to cut me out of the estate and give everything to my brother. Then I walked into the county clerk's office and asked for my original birth certificate. What the clerk handed me proved my mother's entire story was a lie and uncovered a secret she'd been hiding for decades. This section is formatted for direct paste into VidRush custom script mode. I'm Christine, I'm 34. For 4 years, my mother convinced me I was adopted, a story she used to cut me out of the family inheritance and favor my brother. Then I pulled the original county records. The file the clerk handed me proved the adoption never happened. It also uncovered a secret she'd been plotting for decades. It started on a Tuesday evening in November, 4 years ago. I was 30. My mother Carolyn called and said she needed to discuss something important about the family estate. She asked me to come to the house for dinner. I knew something was off because my brother Brandon was there, and he never came to family dinners without being forced. My mother sat us down in the formal dining room, the one with the china cabinet and the portrait of my great-grandfather, and she placed a manila folder on the table between us. She told me I was adopted. She said it with tears in her eyes, the perfect performance, and slid a notarized letter across the table. It was dated 1989, the year I was born, and it stated that my biological mother had surrendered all parental rights. My father Dennis was listed as the adoptive parent alongside Carolyn. She told me she'd wanted to tell me my whole life but couldn't find the right time. Then she dropped the real bomb. Because I was adopted, she explained, the family trust had to be restructured. Brandon was the only biological heir, so the estate, the house, the investments, the lake property would go entirely to him. I was legally not entitled to anything. I remember staring at that letter, trying to make sense of it. The paper was old, yellowed, the signature slightly smudged. I asked to see my original birth certificate. She said it was sealed. I asked who my biological mother was. She said she didn't know, that the adoption had been private, handled through an attorney who had since passed away. I asked why no one had ever mentioned this before. She said they were protecting me. I spent the next 4 years trying to accept it. I moved into a small apartment, downgraded my life, watched Brandon move into the main house after my father passed. I grieved for a family I thought I had. But there were moments, small cracks, that I couldn't ignore. My aunt once slipped and mentioned how much I looked like my grandmother at my age. A second cousin asked why I was so upset because everyone knew Carolyn had been pregnant in 1988. Small inconsistencies that piled up until I couldn't sleep anymore. So 3 months ago, I walked into the County Vital Records office. I filled out the request form for my original birth certificate and any adoption records. The clerk, an older woman with reading glasses and a kind face, asked me to wait. I sat in that hard plastic chair for 45 minutes, palms sweating, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. When she came back, she was holding a thin file. She handed it to me and said something that made my blood run cold. There's no adoption on file, and you need to see what's in here. I opened the file right there at the counter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages. The first document was my original birth certificate, the real one, the one the county had never sealed because there was never any adoption to seal. It listed my mother as Carolyn Marie Fletcher, my father as Dennis Arthur Fletcher, the same parents who had raised me, the same mother who had looked me in the eye and told me I was a stranger's unwanted child. I must have read that birth certificate 10 times, tracing my fingers over my mother's name, over the hospital name, Mercy General, the same hospital where I was born, over the date, March 11, 1989. The clerk waited patiently. When I finally looked up, she said quietly, "That's not all, turn the page." The next document was a notarized legal filing from 1992. I was 3 years old. It was an amendment request to the original birth record, submitted by Carolyn Fletcher, seeking to retroactively add an adoption decree to my file. The stated reason was correction of legal parentage for inheritance purposes. In plain English, my mother had tried to get the county to pretend I was adopted so she could cut me out of the family estate before I was old enough to speak. And the county had rejected it. There was a stamped denial at the bottom of the page, dated February 23, 1993, with a handwritten note from the clerk at the time that read, "Cannot amend birth record to reflect adoption when child is biological offspring of both listed parents. This filing appears to constitute fraud." The word fraud was underlined twice. My mother had been caught 25 years ago. She just never told anyone. She kept the fake documents, the ones she'd shown relatives, and banked on the fact that I would never walk into a county office and ask for the truth. I asked the clerk if I could get certified copies of everything. She made them without a word. As she handed them over, she said, "You're not the first person to find something like this in our files, but you might be the first to have the paperwork to prove it." I asked her what she meant. She explained that in her 20 years working records, she'd seen estranged parents try all kinds of things: fake death certificates, forged adoption papers, backdated trusts, but most of them were never discovered until after the estate was settled and the money was gone. I drove home that day in a daze. I had a folder in my passenger seat that proved my mother had lied for nearly 3 decades. She had stolen my inheritance. She had turned my own brother into the favored child based on a fiction she invented. And she had done it all knowing, for 25 years, that the county had already called her actions fraudulent. But I needed more. I needed to know how far back the deception went. So I hired a forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, who specialized in inheritance fraud and family trust manipulation. She started digging through the trust documents, the property transfers, the will my father had signed before he died. What she found made everything worse. The fake adoption story wasn't just emotional manipulation. It was a coordinated legal strategy. My mother had transferred the lake property into a trust for Brandon 2 months before telling me I was adopted. She had amended the will with a different lawyer than the one who had handled my father's original estate planning, listing me as non-biological child with no inheritance claim. The language was identical to the rejected county filing from 1992. And then Patricia found the last piece. My father's original will, signed in 2010, the year before he got sick, split everything 50-50 between me and Brandon. There was no mention of adoption. No asterisk. No fine print. My mother had rewritten the entire estate after his death, using the fake adoption story to justify what was, in legal terms, outright theft. I knew I couldn't fix this quietly. If I sued, it would drag out for years, and my mother would spend every dollar of the estate fighting me. I needed her to admit it in front of witnesses so there would be no room left for legal maneuvering. And I knew exactly where to do it. The Fletcher family reunion happens every August at the lake property, the same lake property that was supposedly now Brandon's. This year, 30 relatives were expected. Aunts, uncles, cousins, the entire extended family that had heard the adoption story and had quietly pitied me as the non-biological daughter who didn't quite belong. I had 2 months to prepare. I made copies of every document: the birth certificate, the rejected amendment, the will comparison, the property transfer. Then I called my father. Not the father who had passed away, the man I'd always believed was my dad, Dennis Fletcher. I called him because Patricia's research had uncovered a detail I hadn't noticed: his signature on the original birth certificate. He had always known I was his biological child, but my mother had told him, separately, that I had been given up for adoption and then they had adopted me back. She had created 2 versions of the lie, one for me, one for him. He had spent 4 years believing he wasn't my real father, estranged from me by the same fiction. When I told him the truth, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll be at the reunion." My father and I met for coffee 3 days later, the first real conversation we'd had in 4 years. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, carrying the weight of a grief he'd buried under silence. He told me Carolyn had come to him in 2019, weeks after a minor stroke had left him confused and vulnerable. She'd shown him the same notarized letter she'd shown me, the fake adoption letter, and told him I wasn't his biological daughter. He'd been too sick to question it. By the time he recovered enough to think clearly, the estate had been restructured, the lies had hardened into family history, and he believed he had no right to reach out to a child who wasn't truly his. But here's what he didn't know, and what my accountant Patricia didn't discover until she cross-referenced the notary seals. The notary who stamped that adoption letter in 1989 didn't exist. The notary ID number was real, but it belonged to a woman who retired in 1985 and died in 1991, 2 years after the document was supposedly signed. My mother had copied the seal from an old real estate document and backdated the whole thing. Forgery, pure and simple. That meant the document she'd used to convince 30 relatives and a grieving husband wasn't just false, it was a crime. Patricia found something else in the county land records. In 2008, my mother had filed a quitclaim deed attempting to transfer the lake property into a trust she controlled exclusively, without my father's knowledge or signature. The county rejected that too, same clerk, same handwritten note. Fraudulent filing. My mother had been trying to steal the inheritance for over a decade before the adoption story even entered her mind. The adoption was just the final weapon when everything else failed. In the weeks leading up to the reunion, I called every family member I could reach. Not to accuse, just to listen. I wanted to know exactly what Carolyn had told them. The stories varied wildly. To some, I was adopted at birth from a teenage mother. To others, I was a troubled child she'd taken in out of charity. To one elderly cousin, she'd claimed I was actually Dennis's love child from an affair, and she'd graciously agreed to raise me. 3 different lies, all designed to paint me as an outsider. But here's the irony. In every version, I was the beneficiary of Carolyn's supposed generosity. She was the saint saving an unwanted child. And that saintly image was the thread I intended to pull. 3 days before the reunion, my brother Brandon called. I hadn't spoken to him directly since the dinner where my mother dropped the adoption bomb. We met at a diner halfway between our apartments. He was nervous, picking at a paper napkin. He told me he'd always felt something was off. He'd asked our mother once, years ago, why there were no baby pictures of me before age 3. She'd said they were lost in a move. But Brandon had found a box in the attic of our childhood home, a year after I'd moved out. Inside were hospital photos of me in the nursery at Mercy General, with a card that said Baby Girl Fletcher, March 11, 1989. He'd buried the question, too afraid of what the answer would cost him, because by then, the lake property was in his name. The inheritance was his. He'd known the truth for 2 years and said nothing. He told me he couldn't give the inheritance back, not without unraveling everything. But he would be at the reunion and he would not lie for her anymore. That was all I needed. In that moment, the whole shape of the confrontation shifted. It wouldn't be me against my mother. It would be my father, my brother, and me, standing together with the truth. The day of the reunion arrived, August 12th, clear and warm. The lake property was set up with long tables under a white tent, string lights overhead, coolers full of drinks. 30 relatives chatted and laughed, completely unaware that the centerpiece of this year's gathering would be a stack of certified documents and a reckoning 25 years overdue. I put on my forest green blazer, tucked the county file into my bag, and walked into the party with my father on one side and my brother on the other. My mother saw us walk in together, my father on my right, Brandon on my left, and she froze mid-sentence, a glass of white wine suspended in her hand. The relatives didn't notice at first. They were laughing, catching up, passing trays of deviled eggs, but I wasn't there to blend in. I walked straight to the center of the tent, the spot where the toasts usually happen, and I set the county file down on the catering table with a sound loud enough to cut through the chatter. 30 heads turned. My mother's face went from confusion to something harder, something cold. She knew. She didn't know what I had, but she knew the performance was over. I thanked everyone for coming. I said there was a family matter that needed to be addressed, and I apologized in advance for the disruption. Then I opened the file. I held up the certified birth certificate first, my voice steady, reading the names aloud. Carolyn Marie Fletcher, mother. Dennis Arthur Fletcher, father. Christine Elizabeth Fletcher, born March 11, 1989 at Mercy General Hospital. No adoption decree. No sealed record. No mystery biological mother, just the truth on county letterhead stamped and certified 2 weeks ago. My Aunt Margaret leaned forward, squinting. Carolyn, what is this? You told us she was adopted. My mother started to speak, but I didn't give her the chance. I held up the second document, the rejected amendment from 1992. I read the reason for rejection aloud, the word fraud underlined twice. I passed photocopies around the tent so everyone could see the county's own language. Several relatives pulled out their phones, taking pictures, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger. Brandon stepped forward. His voice cracked when he spoke. He told the family that he'd found hospital photos of me in the attic years ago, that he'd stayed silent, that he'd profited from the lie. He said he was surrendering the lake property back to the estate. He said he couldn't undo 4 years, but he could start now. My mother stared at him like she'd never seen him before. Then my father stood up. Dennis Fletcher, 71 years old, a man who'd been told his only daughter wasn't his, who'd spent half a decade mourning a relationship he thought was built on a lie. He looked at Carolyn, his wife of over 40 years, and said, loud enough for every cousin and in-law to hear, "She's my daughter, she always was, and you tried to steal her from me." That was the moment the room broke open. Not chaos, something quieter and heavier. Relatives started asking questions all at once. Where did the adoption papers come from? Who notarized them? What about the will? I answered each one with a document. The forensic accountant's report showing the will had been altered. The property transfer filed 2 months before I was told I was adopted. The notary ID belonging to a woman who died in 1991. I laid it all out, a paper trail 40 years long, every piece of it pointing to one conclusion. My mother had been trying to erase me from the family since I was 3 years old. And then came the detail I hadn't expected. My cousin Ellen, who I hadn't spoken to in years, stood up holding one of the photocopies. She pointed to the signature on the rejected amendment, the county clerk who had underlined fraud, and said, "That's my grandmother, that's Aunt Helen." I hadn't known. No one had. Helen had been a deputy clerk at the Vital Records Office for 30 years. In 1993, she had personally flagged my mother's filing as fraudulent, and then she had died in 2009, never telling anyone in the family what she'd found. The rejection letter was her handwriting. Her defense of a 3-year-old girl she barely knew. Ellen was crying. So was I. My mother didn't say another word. She set down her wine glass, picked up her purse, and walked out of the tent past 30 relatives who didn't try to stop her. I haven't spoken to her since. The reunion didn't end that day. If anything, it restarted. Relatives I'd thought had pitied me came up one by one, apologizing for believing the lie, for not questioning, for letting me carry the weight alone. My brother and I sat by the lake until midnight, not fixing everything but starting. My father told me he was changing his will back, that the lake house would be mine and Brandon's together, the way it was always supposed to be. He gave me a small box that night, something he'd been holding onto for 4 years. My grandmother's ring, the one my mother had claimed only belonged to biological descendants. He said, "She would have wanted you to have this." 1 week later, I filed a formal report with the county prosecutor's office. Forgery of a notary seal, fraudulent amendment of a legal record, theft by deception. They're investigating now. I don't know if my mother will face charges. I don't need her to. The truth is already in the county file, stamped and certified where it can never be rewrit. And the fake adoption papers she carried for decades, they're in a shredder in my garage, along with every lie she ever told. What happened to me is not unique. There are people right now who believe they are adoptees, who have been cut out of inheritances, who carry the quiet weight of being told they don't belong, and they have no idea that the truth is sitting in a county file cabinet, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The records exist. The paper trail doesn't lie. And in my case, the county clerk who stamped fraud on my mother's filing back in 1993 saved my life 30 years later. She had no idea. No thank you card, just a job done correctly. That's the power of institutions when they work. They protect people they've never met from harms they'll never witness. I lost 4 years of my father believing a lie. I lost the family home, the Lake Summers, the early inheritance that should have been mine and my brother's together. But I gained something else. The certainty that the truth, when you finally hold certified copies in your hands, is worth more than any estate. My mother spent decades building a narrative on forged paper. It took one trip to the county records office and 45 minutes of waiting to dismantle it completely. The lie that took a lifetime to construct fell apart in less than an hour. If this story resonated with you, please take a second to like and subscribe. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. I genuinely love knowing where in the world you're listening from. And if there's a file you've been afraid to open, a question you've been afraid to ask your family, consider this your sign. Some truths are buried in paperwork, some are buried in silence, but none of them stay buried forever.